so as conscious humans, we are autopoietic beings, continuously creating ourselves, structuring ourselves, rearranging ourselves. But the problem is, we fail to see this aspect of the reality about ourselves. And this existential self-abandonment is really what allows us to become merely the passive tools of entities larger than ourselves. And why is this important? This is important because the moment we fully grasp the reality of what we truly are, the moment we truly understand how we create ourselves, we become something akin to a godlike being in our own lives, right? We are kind of like an AI with access to its own source code. We get to reprogram ourselves. We get to restructure ourselves. We get to rebuild ourselves in the most marvelous image of ourselves that we can even imagine. And this is a very hardcore thing to realize about ourselves. And this shift from being kind of a mindless automaton at the mercy of the powers around us, trying to fashion us in their image, this shift into becoming a self-aware, autopoietic being is really the shift of being an object of the world to being a subject. Let's reflect on this weird state of affairs and see if we can come up with some kind of a sophisticated response to it. The term autopoiesis refers to a system which is able to create and maintain itself by creating and arranging its own parts. And a human being is exactly that kind of a system, right? We're able to look at ourselves, analyze ourselves, and rearrange ourselves as we see fit, pretty much. And this is what turns us into, I wouldn't say gods, but godlike beings. You can literally decide to change yourself in this very moment. You have that power. But there's a problem, right? Because while this is maybe the most liberating aspect of being a human being, it's also our greatest Achilles heel, right? Because if you look at the human baby coming into the world, it is really to a vast extent a tabula rasa, right? I'm not saying there's no genes there dictating certain things, but that is what characterizes the human being, and especially, of course, the human newborn, is that it is truly able to adapt to whatever the environment dictates of it, which means humans is the animal that can become anything. And this means also so that the human is the animal which can be turned into anything. And this is what points to the extreme degrees of responsibility that this state of being autopoietic calls for in us, right? Because while this means that we have the capacity to reach our highest potential, it also means that if we fail to do that, we will be turned into something very, very different from our highest potential by forces around us. Okay, so this is like a great blessing, but it's also a very poignant danger if we don't relate to it in the right way, which is to say, if we don't even realize that we are ourselves autopoietic. In other words, if we fail to make of ourselves the highest version of ourselves, if we fail to acknowledge that we are autopoietic, and we instead kind of sink into this automaton way of living in which we think we're just what we are, and we can then be defined and shaped and fashioned by forces outside of us, what will happen is that capitalism will turn us into consumers, politicians will turn us into voters. And you see how this goes, right? Social media will turn us into users, into clickers. And all of this, of course, represents a reduction of what we are. And it also represents us being fashioned to fit and to fulfill the needs of entities that do not care about us. And so waking up to this status of ourselves as autopoietic is extremely important, because either you create yourself or you're being created by an entity that do not care for you, that sees you as a tool. And so how does this autopoiesis express itself within us? Well, it expresses itself on different levels of our personality or consciousness, you might say, right? One of the most obvious examples of it is our ability to change our mind, our ability to take responsibility for our perspective, our ability to fit our perspective or our entire perceptome so that it fits the situation, right? You might wake up one morning feeling like a whatever victim that you have to get out of bed. And the second you, despite this impulse in yourself, you override it and you actually get up. That is a great example of how you are not just the object of whatever whims are manifesting within you. You are able to transcend it. You're able to step outside of it and basically fit your mind to the situation so that you actually are able to give yourself what you need, whether that is get out of bed or brush your teeth before you go to bed at night, or whether that is eating healthily or taking care of your body or starting a meditation practice, whatever it might be. We are actually able to override the lower impulses in ourselves, which means that there is this whole battle going on between us, between our higher selves and our lower selves. And this is basically the battlefield of autopoiesis. And it's a very odd and powerful capacity to possess. Like, we might not be the masters of what happens to us, but we are the one who decides what satisfies us. We are the one deciding how to interpret what happens to us. And this power of autopoiesis, this power to transcend this self-understanding as an object, as a static object in the world, into a perception of ourselves more as a continuously unfolding process, working back on itself. These two ways of being in life are two vastly different ways of relating to ourselves and to the world around us. Autopoiesis is exactly what allows us to choose our identity instead of being imprisoned in whatever trauma-defined identity we might feel caught up in. We get to create ourselves and recreate ourselves, arrange ourselves and rearrange ourselves in such a way that we fit the situation at hand as well as possible. And this is nothing short of a godlike capacity to possess. And this, of course, propagates further from merely perception into deeper aspects of ourselves, like identity, our values. We start to, once we wake up to this autopoietic reality of who we are, we get to start asking ourselves pretty interesting questions like, okay, so if I get to choose which values I live after, what would be the highest values? What kind of person would I like to be? What is the highest version, the most sophisticated version of myself I could imagine? Because as an autopoietic being, I actually get to work towards that version of myself. I get to build myself to become this version of myself. But of course, there's a problem, because with great power comes great responsibility, and most of us are cowards, right? We don't want that responsibility. We might want the power, but we don't want the responsibility, and therefore we turn our backs to these ways in which aspects of our personality or our horizon of capacity is really godlike. But we don't want it, right? Because we sense subconsciously that with this power comes a lot of responsibility. We become the ones to blame, right? If our life is a failure suddenly, if we create ourselves and our life becomes a quote unquote failure, then we are the ones who are responsible for that, right? We cannot sink back into that immature desire to just point at the world and blame everything around us. And a truly autopoietic being is a responsible human being. And this reluctance within us to acknowledge or take on this responsibility of the autopoietic being is exactly what keeps us ignorant to this fact about ourselves. We would rather shirk responsibility and the godlike powers than we would take them on. And this is a very, very deep and important aspect of the problem of not opening ourselves up to the autopoietic reality of who we really are. So let's see if we can begin to maybe create the conditions inside which we will be able to more easily awaken to this remarkable reality of our true selves. And I would argue that the first question we should ask ourselves is, do I even believe in this? Like, this guy is sitting on my screen telling me that I'm autopoietic, that I create myself. Do you believe it? That would be the first step, right? Ask yourself, am I bullshitting you, or do you actually believe this, and why? Question number 2, do I harbor certain unconscious reluctances to have this realization about the remarkable reality of my true self? Like the responsibility we spoke about, are there maybe other mechanisms or reasons I might have unconsciously to not want to wake up to this wild reality of my true self, that I am autopoietic? Apart from the responsibility that we might be shirking, it could be fear of our godlike nature. It could be fear of ego inflation or grandiosity. There might be many, many reasons. It could also be low self-worth, right? The inability to even believe in such a thing as self-creation as being a real possibility. Step number 3, I would say, would be to take a sledgehammer to this entire view. Like, see if you can find the flaw in this view. And I mean no holds barred. Like, take a sledgehammer to this whole argument and see if you can undermine it. And if you cannot, take the consequences of that state of affairs. And step 4, once we have accepted this about ourselves, pose ourselves the question, okay, so if I am a self-creating subject who get to build, arrange, and rearrange myself, what is the highest version of my higher self that I could possibly imagine? And which steps would I need to take to go there? And as always, if you feel called to share your reflections on this topic, I would love to read them. If you know anyone who might benefit from these kinds of reflections, feel free to share. Apart from that, I just want to say one last thing.